Welcome to our tour of one of the most unsettling incidents in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. The autumn of 1897 in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia had an extraordinary chill that appeared to lodge deep into the bones of everyone who traveled through Greenbrier Valley. No one could have predicted the darkness that would soon surface from the depths of Widow's Hollow, but the mountain people of Pocahontas County had always known that these old hills harbored secrets. A narrow ravine created by ages of mountain runoff around 12 miles southeast of the village of Marlington. The hollow had earned its name long before the events that would make it infamous. Local records from the Pocahontas County. The area's hazardous terrain and unstable limestone rocks made it unfit for colonization, according to a courthouse from 1855. The name itself came from the small path that looped through high walls of rock, forming an enclosure so complete that the floor of the hollow was always in a state of eternal darkness, even during the middle of the day. Following the passing of her husband Matthias in the mountains, Cordelia Ashworth established her home in this remote area. Winter of 1895. The couple had originally settled in a humble homestead 3 miles closer to town. However, Cordelia made the strange choice to move into the abandoned cottage that had belonged to Matthias's deceased brother, Barnabas Ashworth. When Matthias died suddenly from what the local doctor, Dr. Jeremiah Holloway, described as severe respiratory failure of unknown origin. Due to his reclusive personality and his fascination with the limestone caves, Barnabas had been somewhat of an outsider in the village. The slope behind his property was honeycombed. According to local oral histories collected decades later, Barnabas had spent the latter years of his life exploring and documenting the huge cave system, claiming he was performing geological study for a mining business that no one in town had ever heard of. When he was found dead in his cabin in 1893, allegedly of natural causes, his copious writings and cave maps disappeared, possibly taken by Cordelia when she later claimed the property. The cabin itself was a modest edifice composed of local stone and lumber with 2 major rooms and a root cellar that had been excavated straight into the limestone bedrock. The property was unique because it was close to the mouth of a limestone cavern known to the locals as Ashworth's Cave. The hole opened like a wide gash in the slope about 50 yards behind the cabin. The cave opening was large enough for a person to walk through erect, yet it bent sharply to the left within 30 feet, vanishing into absolute darkness. Cordelia's desire to go to such an isolated region raised questions among the residents of Marlington, but mountain dwellers had always accepted a person's right to grieve in their own way. At 38 years of age, she was deemed past the age when remarriage was likely, and without heirs to perpetuate the family name, her choice to live alone was viewed as unpleasant, but not wholly shocking. What was remarkable, however, was how rapidly Cordelia seemed to adapt to her new circumstances. According to Ezekiel Crane, who operated a tiny general store in Marlington and kept thorough records of his customers' purchase habits, Cordelia made her first visit to town exactly 1 week after arriving to the valley. She purchased basic goods, wheat, salt, preserves, and lamp oil, but also made numerous unexpected requests that Crane documented in his notebook with evident bewilderment. According to documents found during a 1962 renovation of the structure that formerly housed Crane's store, Cordelia expressly asked about buying huge quantities of. Quicklime was used to neutralize odors and preserve organic substances. Cordelia made arrangements to have multiple sacks brought straight to her cabin after Crane clarified that he usually only kept modest quantities for domestic usage. Additionally, she bought an unusual quantity of rope, heavy canvas tarpaulins, and what Crane noted in his notes as mining equipment appropriate for subterranean operations. Later, Tobias Garner, the town postmaster, noted that Cordelia started getting regular letters from addresses in Charleston and Wheeling, West Virginia, as well as from Richmond, Virginia. The letters arrived with uncommon frequency, often 3 or 4 in a single week, and were always addressed in the same clean handwriting. Years later, when asked if there was anything strange about these letters, Garner said that they frequently had a strange musty scent, as though they had been kept in a moist location before being mailed. As October advanced into the severe mountain winter of 1897, Cordelia's excursions to town grew. Increasingly infrequent, Cordelia attended services on a regular basis through October, but she did not show up for the Harvest Festival in early November, according to the Marlington Methodist Church's records, where attendance was meticulously recorded. Reverend Marcus Whitmore recorded in his weekly diary that several parishioners had voiced concern about the widow's welfare, particularly given her isolated living circumstances and the early commencement of what would prove to be one of the most severe winters in recent memory. The Reverend's diaries, kept in the West Virginia Historical Society archives, provide vital insight into the community's growing uneasiness about Cordelia's condition. In an entry dated November 18, 1897, Reverend Whitmore wrote, "Mrs. Ashworth's absence from divine services has become a matter of considerable concern among the congregation. Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, my dear wife, has attempted twice to visit the widow in her mountain retreat, but has been unable to locate the cabin in the maze. It would not be until the spring thaw of 1898 that anyone from the community would successfully reach Cordelia's cabin, and by then it would be too late. Of the logging trails that crisscross Widow's Hollow, I have decided to organize a proper expedition to check on her welfare before the heavy snows make passage impossible." However, this expedition was delayed by an early blizzard that struck the region on November 22nd. Dumping nearly 3 feet of snow across the mountain passes and making travel treacherous for several weeks. Be too late to understand what had transpired during those long winter months. The first hint that something was terribly wrong came in March of 1898, when melting snow began to expose debris that had washed down from the upper reaches of Widow's Hollow. Jeremiah Blackwood, a local trapper who regularly checked his lines along the creek that ran through the hollow, discovered several disturbing items caught in a beaver dam approximately 2 miles downstream from Cordelia's cabin. Among the debris were pieces of heavy canvas tarpaulin torn and stained with what appeared to be old blood, several lengths of rope that had been cut or chewed through, and, most disturbingly, fragments of human clothing that Blackwood recognized as belonging to travelers who had passed through the area during the previous autumn. Blackwood immediately reported his discoveries to the county sheriff, Amos Crawford, who assembled a small posse to investigate. Sheriff Crawford's official report filed with the county courthouse on March. The search party's findings upon arriving at Cordelia's cabin on the 15th of 1898 are described in detail. The building itself seemed unharmed by the severe winter smoke was still rising from the chimney, suggesting recent habitation. But the area surrounding the cabin revealed signs of significant activity that seemed incompatible with the presence of a single occupant, and the ground behind the cabin, between the structure and the cave mouth, was severely disturbed despite the recent. The posse found Cordelia sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch, seemingly waiting for them. There were deep grooves in the ground that suggested heavy objects had been dragged repeatedly along the same path, which was more concerning than the snow cover. Crawford's report describes multiple areas where the earth appears to have been excavated and refilled, creating an irregular pattern of mounds and depressions extending from the cabin to the cave entrance. Her appearance suggests that the winter had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental condition. Her hair, which had been described as auburn when she first arrived in the hollow, had turned completely white. Her weight had dropped dramatically, giving her face a gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance that several members of the posse later described as corpse-alike. Most unsettling was her demeanor during the initial questioning. According to Crawford's report, Cordelia appeared to be in a state of extreme agitation. When asked about her well-being and whether she needed help, Cordelia said that she had been keeping busy with important work and that the cave requires constant attention. However, when Crawford asked permission to examine the cave, Cordelia became visibly distressed, insisting that the cave was not ready for visitors and that she needed more time to complete her arrangements. Cordelia would often glance toward the cave entrance and mutter under her breath in what sounded like conversations with invisible companions. Legal authority in such matters rested with the sheriff, and Crawford proceeded with his investigation despite her objections. The cave entrance revealed evidence of extensive modification since Cordelia had taken residence. Heavy wooden beams had been installed to reinforce the natural limestone arch, and a system of pulleys and ropes had been constructed that appeared designed for moving heavy objects into and out of the cave. The limestone floor near the entrance showed wear patterns consistent. Crawford's party made their first unsettling discovery about 30 feet into the cave, where the passage curved sharply to the left. The natural cave floor had been methodically excavated, creating a series of rectangular depressions, each roughly the size and shape of a human grave. The excavations were lined with the heavy canvas tarpaulins that Cordelia had bought from Crane's store, and each depression showed evidence of recent use. More horrifying was the discovery of personal effects scattered throughout this section of the cave. Crawford's inventory, documented in painful detail, included clothing, shoes, jewelry, and personal documents belonging to at least 7 different individuals. Among these items were the papers of Hiram McIntosh, a traveling tinker who had disappeared while passing through the area in October, the distinctive brass buttons from the coat worn by Samuel Hendris, a merchant from, the wedding ring of Martha Copeland, an elderly woman who had been traveling to visit family in Pocahontas County but had never reached her destination, and Lewisburg, who had disappeared in November. The deeper portions of the cave showed evidence of even more systematic activity. Natural chambers had been connected by excavated passages, creating a network of underground spaces that extended far beyond what the original cave system would have naturally provided. The limestone walls bore tool marks indicating months of. After meticulous excavation, Crawford's team found what appeared to be Cordelia's workshop in the deepest accessible chamber, about 200 feet from the cave entrance. There were several large metal tubs that seemed to have been used for butchering, as well as crude tables made of limestone slabs with stains and tool marks that suggested they had been used for butchering. Salvaged from the abandoned mining operations that had once been common in the area, contained residues that gave off a powerful odor of decay despite the application of large quantities of quicklime. Most disturbing were the detailed records that Cordelia had maintained throughout the winter. Written in her careful handwriting on pages torn from account ledgers, these documents cataloged each visitor to her cabin with meticulous attention to detail. Each entry included the person's name, age. The final entry in these records, dated March 10, 1898, 5 days prior to Crawford's arrival, simply stated, "Preparations complete. Final arrangements made. Accounts settled in full." When faced with this evidence, Cordelia's response was, "It's a clinical, businesslike tone that suggested complete detachment from the reality of what these records actually documented." Both chilling and incomprehensible. According to Crawford's report, she explained that she had been fulfilling a contract that her late husband, Matthias, had made before his death. She claimed that Matthias had received correspondence from business associates who required certain services that could only be provided in complete isolation. The cave, with its natural preservation properties and complete concealment from outside observation, had been ideal for this purpose. Cordelia maintained that. She was simply completing work that Matthias had begun, and that she had been compensated through the regular mail deliveries that Garner had observed. When pressed for details about the nature of this work, she became increasingly agitated, insisting that her clients had very specific requirements that she was contractually obligated to fulfill. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy of horrifying scope. The correspondence that Cordelia had been receiving was traced to several funeral homes, and at a time when medical science was developing quickly, the demand for anatomical specimens far outstripped the legal supply, creating a lucrative black market for human remains. It turned out that Matthias had established himself as a supplier in this underground economy, using the remote cave system to deliver fresh human remains for anatomical study and embalming experimentation to medical schools in Charleston, Wheeling, and Richmond, which had been paying large sums for their delivery. Process and preserve remains before shipping them to his customers. His sudden death had left Cordelia with knowledge of his activities and a financial incentive to continue them. The isolated location of the cabin, combined with the natural concealment provided by the cave, had allowed her to expand the operation far beyond what Matthias had originally envisioned. Rather than simply supplying existing remains, Cordelia had begun creating inventory by targeting travelers who passed through the isolated mountain roads. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the remote location of the crimes and the limited law enforcement resources available in Pocahontas County. Cordelia was arrested and held in the county jail in Marlington, while authorities tried to identify all of the victims and trace the network of customers who had disappeared, as disappearances could be easily attributed to the treacherous conditions and the risk of getting lost in blizzards during the winter months. Had been receiving the remains, but the case would never go to trial. Cordelia was discovered dead in her cell on the evening of March 28, 1898, precisely 13 days after her arrest. Dr. Holloway's official report stated that she appeared to have died of natural causes related to the extreme physical and mental stress of the previous months, but several details about her death remained unexplained. Samuel Thornton, the jailkeeper, reported that throughout her incarceration Cordelia had maintained. Thornton heard Cordelia talking animatedly with someone in her cell on the night of her death, carrying on what sounded like a detailed business conversation. When he investigated, he found her alone, seemingly talking to the wall. What was more perplexing was a letter discovered in Cordelia's cell after her death, written in her recognizable handwriting, addressed to an unidentified recipient, and contained detailed instructions for discovering and accessing the cave system. The message finished with the mysterious sentence, "The effort must continue. The cave recalls everything. Someone will understand." Sheriff Crawford ordered the installation of sturdy timber barricades across the entrance and the posting of warning signs stating that the location was unsafe and closed to the public, which effectively shut the cave. These precautions, however, were not enough to deter inquisitive residents from visiting the location. During the summer of 1898, locals of Widow's Hollow reported hearing construction and excavation noises at night, seeing people carrying lanterns close to the entrance, and suspicious activity surrounding the locked cave. Dr. Silas Peaton, a professor of geology at West Virginia University, who had become interested in the subject through media reports, got permission from county authorities to perform a scientific inspection of the cave in September 1898. Peaton's initial assessment was meant to evaluate whether the property posed any ongoing public health dangers and to chronicle the extent of the modifications that had been made to the natural cave system. What Peaton discovered during his research exceeded anything that had been documented in the original sheriff's reports. The cave system reached far deeper into the mountain than anyone had previously anticipated, with excavated corridors connecting natural chambers across a distance of nearly half a mile. Evidence of recent activity that predated Cordelia's was found in a number of compartments. dead by several months, including recently erected wooden supports and new tool markings on the walls. Piton's discovery of a completely furnished underground workshop in one of the darkest chambers was the most unsettling. Unlike the primitive tables and machinery located near the entry, this facility appears to have been erected with much expertise and investment. Along with a sophisticated network of pipes and reservoirs that supplied flowing water from an underground source, metal tables with drainage systems had been constructed. Spring, a collection of surgical tools and anatomical texts, along with well-organized chemical supplies on shelves, indicated that the person running this facility was well-versed in medicine. Piton's increasing awareness that he was not alone in the cave system is documented in his field notes, which are kept in the university archives. On his third day of research, he noticed hearing sounds of activity from deeper chambers that halted abruptly when he approached. Tool markings on the walls seemed new, and he discovered indications of recent cleaning and reorganization in a number of chambers. Piton had direct touch with the present dwellers of the cave on the last day of his scheduled survey. Working alone in one of the higher chambers, he was approached by a guy who introduced himself as Dr. Aldrich Mortensen, claiming to be a physician from Baltimore, who had traveled to West Virginia to resume the anatomical research that had been interrupted by Cordelia's incarceration. According to Mortensen, it represented a major investment in specialized equipment and infrastructure that could not be readily moved. He asserted that he and a number of colleagues had contracts with research institutes and medical schools that needed a consistent flow of anatomical specimens. The remote location and natural preservation features of the cave made it an excellent setting for their work, and they intended to continue operations despite of local legal concerns. According to Piton's notes, he was first reluctant to report this conversation to authorities, but Mortensen presented him with many university credentials and letters of introduction that appeared to legalize his activities. Moreover, Mortensen offered Piton substantial cash for his participation in maintaining the secrecy of the operation along with access to anatomical specimens that would be valuable for his own geological studies. The details of Piton and Mortensen's agreement were never completely recorded. However, university records reveal that Piton suddenly acquired a major research grant in late 1898 that allowed him to broaden his geological studies throughout the Appalachian region. His later works on limestone cave systems had intricate anatomical depictions that were extremely complex and realistic for the era. Local authorities continued to receive claims of strange activity in Widow's Hollow throughout the ensuing years, but these reports were typically written off as folklore or incorrect observations. Regular surveillance was not feasible due to the cave's isolated location, and county officials were hesitant to devote resources to keeping an eye on a place that didn't seem to be a direct threat to public safety. But when a team of Methodist missionaries traveling through the region in the spring of 1902 found evidence of new graves in the forest around the cave site, everything changed drastically. Unlike the shallow depressions that had been identified in the cave itself, these appeared to be formal burial grounds marked with crude wooden crosses and placed in neat rows like a proper cemetery. Reverend Whitmore, who had retained an interest in the matter since Cordelia's incarceration, arranged a volunteer expedition to inspect these burial places. What they discovered revealed that the activities in the cave had expanded much beyond what anyone had previously thought. The forest cemetery featured at least 30 designated graves, each with a wooden marker with only a number and date. The dates varied from 1899 to early 1902, demonstrating that operations had continued and intensified after Piton's survey. The finding of a tiny structure that had been erected in a clearing about a quarter of a mile from the cave entrance was more unsettling. In reality, the building, which was designed to look like a rural mountain chalet, was a receiving station where victims could be kept in temporary housing before to being processed in the cave facility. The structure housed medical supplies, restraining devices, and thorough documents that documented the processing of dozens of persons during a 3-year period. These documents demonstrated the full extent of what had developed into an advanced business enterprise. Victims were being recruited from urban areas through fake work prospects, promises of medical treatment, or plain kidnapping. They were taken to the mountain facility and processed in accordance with the individual needs of different clients. The organization had evolved to encompass many physicians, embalmers, and support workers who lived in makeshift camps dotted over the surrounding wilderness. When it became clear that the operation had been obtaining victims from several states, federal authorities were involved in the inquiry for the first time. In June 1902, U.S. Marshal Henry Caldwell oversaw a well-planned raid on the site that resulted in the arrest of 7 people and the confiscation of copious amounts of criminal network paperwork. The raid was only partially successful, though. Dr. Mortensen was among the important individuals who were able to flee into the deep cave system before law enforcement could capture them. Efforts to chase them into the underground passages were abandoned when 2 federal agents became trapped in the tangle of tunnels and had to be rescued after 3 days underground. The cave was permanently shut with dynamite charges that collapsed the main channels, but federal authorities feared that other entrances permitted the core group to continue operating from deeper chambers. For a number of additional years, reports of strange activity in the area persisted, decreasing in frequency over time, yet never totally stopping. Although Dr. Peaton's role in these incidents was never made public, university documents indicate that his scientific career terminated suddenly in 1902. His personal documents submitted to the university archives upon his death in 1924 contain a confession letter dated 1903 in which he explained his collaboration with the cave operation and expressed tremendous regret for his role in enabling the murders that followed. This confession states that Peaton had initially thought that he was taking part in valid medical study, but over time he came to understand that the operation was using murdered victims instead of naturally deceased people. He was so implicated in the operations by the time he realized their true nature that he was afraid of being prosecuted if he tried to report the offenses. His sister's medical schooling and his aging parents had been paid for with the large sums of money he received for his participation, resulting in financial responsibilities that made it harder for him to withdraw from the deal. Peyton's confession also disclosed further details regarding the extent of the operation. According to his story, the subterranean site was merely one component of a network that comprised comparable installations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. The enterprise comprised trained embalmers who could preserve remains for extended periods of time and prepare them in accordance with customer specifications, and victims were moved between locations as needed. Extremely precise anatomical requirements. Petton's account of his last trip to the cave in late 1901, when he learned that the procedure had progressed beyond merely providing anatomical specimens, marked the end of the confession. He discovered that the cave facility had been altered to meet the needs of some clients who were asking for live subjects for medical experiments. Peyton had eventually cut off all communication with the organization, since he could no longer justify his continuous involvement in such activities. Yet continued to be troubled by his awareness of atrocities he was unable to disclose. The exact size of the subterranean operation was never fully known, as many of the records were destroyed when the facility was abandoned. Federal investigators estimated that at least 100 persons had been processed through the facility during its 4 years of operation, but the true number may have been substantially higher. The identification of victims was made more difficult by the fact that many had been temporary residents or people whose disappearances would not have been promptly reported to authorities. For decades after the cave was sealed, locals in Widow's Hollow continued to describe strange occurrences. These accounts often feature sounds of underground activity, infrequent sightings of lights moving through the forest at night, and the discovery of items that appeared to have been recently placed despite the area's purported abandonment. A forest fire that ravaged the area in 1923 revealed many previously undiscovered graveyards in the vicinity of the original cave site. When authorities looked into these finds, they discovered evidence that suggested they were considerably more recent than the burials recorded in 1902. This led to conjecture that parts of the original enterprise may have continued operating from different places. However, no solid proof was ever discovered to back up these beliefs, and as the initial participants passed away and local memories faded, interest in the case steadily declined. Only authorized officials and researchers were allowed access once the area was eventually included in the Monongah National Forest. In 1965, University of Virginia forensic anthropologist Dr. Miranda Holbrook was granted permission to carry out a thorough assessment of the region as part of a larger investigation of historical crime scenes in Appalachian villages. Additional proof of the cave operation was discovered during her digs, including the personal belongings of numerous victims and pieces of the advanced equipment that had been used at the underground facility. Most importantly, Holbrook's examination showed that the original cave system was much larger than anyone had previously thought. Ground-penetrating radar suggested a network of natural and excavated passages that extended for miles through the mountain, connecting numerous chambers and allowing multiple points of access to the surface. The dynamite charges used to shut the cave in 1902 had destroyed only a small section of this structure, keeping most of the subterranean facility intact and possibly reachable. Holbrook's finding of a partially preserved laboratory in one of the deep chambers provided insight into the advanced nature of the medical treatments that had been conducted in the cave. Equipment uncovered at the site included surgical instruments of outstanding quality, chemical apparatus for preservation and embalming, and precise anatomical charts that suggested a level of medical understanding much surpassing what would be anticipated in an isolated mountain site. The operations medical director was identified in personal journals discovered in the laboratory as Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, a distant relative of Matthias and Barnabas Ashworth, who had reportedly been engaged in the subterranean facility's design from the beginning. Dr. Ashworth had been a distinguished physician in Richmond before his medical license was withdrawn in 1896, following charges of illicit testing on patients. His notebooks suggested that he had viewed the underground project as an opportunity to continue his studies without regulatory intervention. Additionally, the journals showed that Dr. Ashworth had been experimenting with methods of preservation that went well beyond the straightforward embalming techniques applied to anatomical specimens. His work was on ways to keep biological specimens in a condition that would, for prolonged investigation and testing, such as efforts to preserve brain tissue for analysis of brain activity. The majority. Ashworth's notes on studies that seemed to involve keeping victims alive during various treatments were unsettling. It appears that certain clients who were interested in examining physiological reactions in a controlled setting requested these trials. The advanced equipment found in the subterranean laboratory would have been capable of supporting such study, and Ashworth's notes suggest that these trials persisted until the facility was finally abandoned. Finally, Holbrook's report, submitted to the University of Virginia in 1967, advised that the entire region be permanently locked and banned from public access. According to her findings, the cave system had been the site of criminal activity on a scale greater than anything previously recorded in American criminal history, and it would take resources not available for such a project to fully excavate and document all evidence. However, Holbrook's ideas were never implemented. She had a serious nervous breakdown shortly after turning in her report, which put an end to her academic career. According to co-workers who paid her a visit while she was in the hospital, She had developed an obsession with the notion that the cave operation was still going on and that its current operators had taken notice of her studies. Holbrook stated that she had been getting threatening messages over her research and that multiple break-ins at her university office had led to the theft of pictures and documents from the cave survey. She also alleged that she had been followed by unidentified individuals during the final weeks of her fieldwork, and that equipment and supplies had been strangely relocated or destroyed during her digs. These allegations were ascribed by university officials to the psychological strain of dealing with such unsettling content. But Holbrook's field helpers eventually acknowledged that odd incidences had occurred throughout the study. It was true that the equipment had been tampered with. Photographs taken in the deep rooms, though held in sealed containers, had been methodically destroyed, and several excavation sites had been purposefully filled in throughout the night. Early in 1967, the cave survey effort came to an end, and all research-related items were placed under restricted access. Holbrook reportedly insisted that the underground operation was still going on, and that her investigation had only revealed a small amount of the truth while spending the last years of her life in a secluded sanitarium, part of continuing illegal activity. What actually happens in the depths of Widow's Hollow is still a mystery. Federal authorities maintain that the area has been extensively searched and that no indication of current criminal activity has been identified. Nonetheless, locals are still reporting mysterious occurrences that point to continued human habitation in the ostensibly deserted area. In isolated areas of the Depression, Forest Service patrols have discovered evidence of recent construction activity, containing recently constructed wooden buildings and paved walkways that don't seem to have any forestry or recreational value. Some hikers and hunters have found recently excavated areas that indicate ongoing mining or building activity, and others have reported hearing noises of mechanical equipment operating underground. The accounts from folks who say they have seen persons in the forest who don't look like regular hikers or hunters are the most unsettling. Usually, these people are characterized as being abnormally pale, clothed in outmoded clothing, and carrying equipment that is not fit for recreational outdoor activities. When approached, they tend to escape rapidly into the dense forest, typically in routes that lead toward the shut cave entrance. Law enforcement authorities' stated stance is that these reports either misidentify authorized forest visitors or are influenced by local legend about the area's troubling past. Nevertheless, a number of sheriff's deputies who have looked into these. Concern is quietly voiced about the report's apparent trends, which are hard to explain using traditional methods. Deputy Marshal Rebecca Hartwell, who has been responsible for law enforcement in the Widow's Hollow area since 1995, agrees that the territory provides continual issues for public safety. Regular surveillance is impractical due to the distant location and the vast underground system that was never fully mapped, which offers many opportunities for criminal activity to be concealed. Hartwell has documented several incidents that suggest possible ongoing criminal activity, including the discovery of recently used campsites in areas that are supposed to be inaccessible, evidence of large-scale food storage in concealed locations, and the occasional recovery of personal items that appear to belong to missing persons from other regions. Nevertheless, thorough inspections of the region have never yielded enough evidence to support a significant probe. The terrain is incredibly difficult to navigate. The system of caves remains partially collapsed and dangerous to enter, and any personnel operating in the region have proven expert at avoiding detection. There may never be a definitive answer to the question of what actually goes on in Widow's Hollow. The initial cave operation showed that even with today's enhanced communications and law enforcement capabilities, criminal enterprises of startling size can still operate covertly in remote enough areas. The Appalachian Mountains are home to thousands of such hollows, many of which are as remote and challenging to keep an eye on. The limestone geology that made Widow's Hollow attractive to the initial operation exists throughout the region, giving natural camouflage for operations that society would prefer not to acknowledge. The fact that the subterranean operation ultimately succeeded in achieving its main goal is possibly the most unsettling. Even after it was made public, there were arrests and investigations, but the network of clients who had purchased specimens and services from the facility was never fully identified. Similar businesses are encouraged to expand in other areas by the ongoing demand for the anatomical supplies and test subjects that fueled the initial operation. The legacy of Cordelia Ashworth and the horrors that erupted from Widow's Hollow serves as a reminder that civilization is frequently more thinner than we would like to believe. In the shadows outside the bounds of the law, and yet there's still chances for human behavior to go to levels that most people cannot comprehend. The mountains remember everything, and some secrets refuse to remain buried. Remember that these ancient mountains have seen things that history would rather forget as you stroll through West Virginia's woodlands, especially in those deep hollows where the sun seldom shines and the quiet appears to be pressing against your eardrums. The bedrock's limestone caverns continue to reverberate with murmurs from the past, and some of those rumors may not be totally historical. The observant observer might notice that certain spots seem abnormally well maintained for apparently abandoned locales, or that forest roots appear to receive more activity than their distant positions would suggest. The odd finding of objects that obviously don't belong in wilderness environments, such as chemical supplies, medical equipment, and documents with current dates, serves as a reminder that not all of the area's troubling past belongs in the past. And if you should hear sounds from beneath the forest floor, or catch glimpses of lights moving through the trees where no light should be, perhaps it would be good to remember that some investigations are best left to others. The mountains have always preserved their secrets, and some of those secrets are protected by guardians who prefer not to be disturbed. Although the Widow's Hollow cave is shut, the network it supported has shown remarkable flexibility. In an area where missing, the work that started with Cordelia Ashworth might very well continue today. Since traveler disappearances are common, person reports frequently go uninvestigated for weeks, and the immense wilderness serves as the ideal cover for actions that society refuses to acknowledge. The next time you find yourself driving alone across Appalachia's isolated roads, keep in mind that these mountains are not always deserted and have a lengthy history. Certain appetites are never sated. Some contracts are never fulfilled.